So I'm going to start with this session. So welcome. This session is entitled Shaping the Future of MRI, Closing Thoughts. It's our last session. So I want to encourage everyone to ask questions through the Q&A box that should be on the bottom of the screen, and all questions are welcome. We want to have some lively discussions, so it's important to have your questions and feedback. So we're gonna start the session with a talk by Benjamin Tendler from the University of Oxford, and he's going to talk about why every lab needs a handbook. So Ben, go for it.
Thanks. Okay, I'll just share my screen. Can you see and hear me okay, and see the screen?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. All right. I'll get started. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and for those of you here for taking the time to listen to this presentation. So to begin, I want you all to imagine that you have two new junior researchers joining your lab. These new researchers arrive. Everybody seems to be extremely friendly. And before you know it, they're sitting at their desks preparing their first research experiments. Unfortunately, nobody's taken the time to sit down with these researchers and give them a bit of a sense of what is expected from them and what they can expect from other members of the lab. And as time goes on, they begin to form their own opinions. The first researcher looks around and notices that everybody seems to be getting so much fantastic work done, publishing papers, attending conferences, and generally pushing back the frontiers of science. They conclude from this that their principal investigator must expect them to work extremely long hours, perhaps including weekends, in order to make similar progress. One day, the student has a brilliant idea and writes an email to their principal investigator describing this idea in great detail. Unfortunately, they haven't really got much of a sense of how their principal investigator works or just how busy they are. And when they receive a very shortly worded email response to their original idea, they conclude the shortness of the response means that the idea probably wasn't a very good one. Now, our second researcher has got some prior lab experience, but it wasn't necessarily a comprehensive one. They're not sure how to collaborate and are concerned that if they share their ideas with other members of the lab, that they may take them for their own. In addition, for personal reasons, the researcher is particularly concerned about an upcoming international conference, as they do not feel comfortable traveling to the country where it's being held. However, they don't feel that they can raise this with other members of the lab, as everybody just seems to be so excited by the possibility of traveling abroad. Now, it isn't just more junior members that can be impacted by these challenges. An experienced technician, for example, may feel frustrated that when people approach them to discuss projects and research, there always seems to be a sense of urgency and little value is given to their time. In addition, they may feel that they're not acknowledged or considered in the same way as other researchers in the groups with outputs such as authorship on publications, even though they make a substantial contribution to projects. A principal investigator may notice that a member of the lab appears to be unhappy and unmotivated. They may want to have a conversation with them in order to see if some changes can be made to address the challenges, but be unsure how to approach this in a conversation which is sensitive to their well-being. More broadly, the principal investigator may wish to have a conversation with different members of the lab to get a sense of how things are currently operating, to see if improvements could be made, but be unsure how to initiate these conversations. So how do these challenges arise? Well, fundamentally, we all know that there's no single rule book to academia. Different departments and even different groups within the same department can operate in quite different ways. And ultimately, principal investigators are responsible for setting the guidelines for a lab. However, oftentimes these guidelines are not communicated effectively to individual lab members. And this can lead to challenges for individuals in addition to how the group operates. By not knowing how the group is supposed to operate, it can be challenging to identify and effectively communicate conflicts that may arise, leading to friction between individual group members and a loss of lab productivity. In addition, if you don't know how you're supposed to work in the lab, it can lead to the adoption of unsustainable working policies, such as working extremely long hours, leading to burnout. If you don't know what resources are available to you, you may not feel empowered to discuss personal circumstances that impact your well-being in addition to your work. And if you don't know how the lab is supposed to operate, you may not understand your responsibilities within a lab environment, which can lead to a loss of productivity of the lab as well. And in addition to this, there are many questions that can arise during somebody's time within a lab, where answers may not be that easy to find. Questions such as, what should I do now in order to best prepare myself for the next career stage? If I'm part of a collaboration, how can I get recognition that reflects the amount that I've contributed to the project? If I have family or caring responsibilities, how will the lab help me find an effective work-life balance? If I decide to leave the lab or decide to leave academia entirely, will my principal investigator help me find my next job? And if I'm having a problem with a colleague, who or what resources are available to me in order to address this? So how do we propose to address this? We propose to address this by encouraging all labs to write a document which outlines how their lab operates, which we refer to as a lab handbook. So what is a lab handbook? A lab handbook is a flexible resource which describes the roles and expectations of researchers within your group at different career stages, the culture of your research group, and how your lab supports the development of individual members. I just want to highlight what a lab handbook isn't briefly, and it isn't just a recipe book describing how to perform specific lab tasks, such as, for example, how to run a MRI scan or how to obtain information from a computing cluster. Whilst these things are very useful in their own right, here what I'm really talking about is a resource which is linked to the culture and ethos of your lab. And so how could a lab handbook integrate into your lab? Well, the idea is that all members read the lab handbook. This includes existing members in addition to members who are joining the lab. This provides everybody with a consistent and transparent message. Everybody within the group will have the exact same information about how the lab is supposed to operate and what their responsibilities are. By doing this, it provides us with a sense of accountability. By understanding how the lab operates and what our responsibilities are, it enables us to very quickly identify when we or another member of the lab is not living up to these principles in order to address this and therefore prevent a loss of lab productivity and potential friction. In addition, we consider lab handbooks to be an evolving document. What this means is that by writing down how the lab currently operates, it provides context to have discussions about how the lab operates and to identify if there are places that could be improved to improve the overall productivity of the lab. In order to motivate this in more concrete terms, I'm going to give an example from the Win Physics group, of which I am a member. And a few years ago, we set out to write our own lab handbook. So who are the Win Physics group? Well, we are a group based at the Wellcome Centre for Integrative Neuroimaging at the University of Oxford. We consist of approximately 30 researchers that span many different areas of an academic environment. We have principal investigators, we have postdocs, we have doctoral students, in addition to core staff. What does our lab handbook contain? Well, broadly, it's split up into three main themes. The first theme is the theme of roles and expectations. And in this, we really describe the responsibilities of researchers at different career stages within our group. In our second theme, we talk about research group culture. And in this, we describe how we expect people to conduct themselves within the workplace, how to find a healthy work-life balance, our commitment to EDI initiatives, in addition to how to be a good citizen within the lab. And finally, in the theme of developing as researchers, we talk about our commitment to the development of individual members within the lab. We talk about career development opportunities, how we expect science to be performed in the lab, how to get the most out of collaborations and conferences, in addition to our work with outreach activities as well. To motivate this a bit further, I'm going to give a single example from each of the themes. And starting with the roles and expectations theme, we have a section on principal investigators. And in this section, we really describe what it means to be a principal investigator. What is a typical day for a principal investigator? What challenges can they face? What can more junior members expect from their principal investigator? And in return, how can more junior members help their principal investigator? By writing this down, we aim to explicitly help the communication between principal investigators and other members of the lab, and hopefully improve productivity in the process. In our research group culture section, we have a part on good citizenship. And in this, we really describe how we expect everybody to be able to pitch in, support the overall functioning of the lab when they are able to do so. Now, for our lab, as I'm sure for your lab, there are many different ways which we can achieve this. For us, we talk about how we can support the development of new members by, for example, tutoring on departmental programs designed for incoming students. How you can support your colleagues' research by answering their questions if they have them. How we can support our colleagues' studies by, for example, being a volunteer for an MRI scan, if you feel comfortable in doing so. But more broadly, stepping up when an individual member or the lab as a whole asks for help with something. And finally, in our Developing as Researchers theme, we have a section on responsible science. And in this, we really talk about how we expect science to be performed within our lab, how we expect people to leave their results in a reproducible state with curated data, meaning that somebody else can work with it if they want to, having commented in accessible code, which is readable by others, in addition to having a lab notebook to document how you are performing your research. We also highlight a few more serious things around research ethics and our expectations there, talking about topics such as plagiarism and data manipulation, and what to do if you believe that yourself, or perhaps another member of the lab, is not abiding by these principles. So to give you a sense as to how we approach writing our lab handbook, we started by having a call for volunteers within the group who would be interested in contributing to the lab handbook. Once we had volunteers, we started with a series of brainstorming sessions where we thought about what topics we would like to include in our handbook. We managed to achieve this by looking at different lab handbooks online, in addition to other online resources which were available to us to help us understand what topics would be useful to include. Once we'd done these brainstorming sessions, we had a list of topics. We delegated the topics between individual volunteers, who then went about to write first drafts. And following this, we shared these drafts with other volunteers, which were then edited with feedback provided in order to create the final text for our lab handbook. This final text was then curated by a small group of volunteers, including myself, and we also sought some external advice on specific topics which were more relevant at the departmental level, such as by speaking to HR. And finally, when we had our lab handbook, we organized a series of read-through and feedback sessions with the entire group to make sure that everybody would be willing to commit to the principles which we'd written down. And at that point, we had our lab handbook completed. Now, we wrote our lab handbook during COVID, so timelines are a bit difficult to define. But broadly, what I would say is that for a large group, a lab handbook can be easily achieved within a single term. And if you have a smaller group, it could be quicker than this as well. In addition, in a few slides, I'm going to describe some resources that we've developed to help facilitate writing a lab handbook for other groups, which we also believe can accelerate this process. So why should you engage in an initiative such as lab handbooks? Well, the first reason is hopefully for all of the reasons above. Hopefully, I've been able to motivate you why a lab handbook can be a really useful resource for both a group in addition to individual members. Secondly, the likelihood is that your group probably wants it. Research from the Wellcome Trust based in the UK has indicated that there's typically limited understanding for more junior members of what their principal investigators expect from them. And we found within our own department that there was a strong demand for lab handbooks from more junior members, even if this is not seen by their principal investigator. And finally, whilst I don't believe that this should be a reason to write a lab handbook on its own, there is an increased emphasis from funders on being able to demonstrate commitment to good lab practice. And a lab handbook is a good example of this. And so by engaging with an initiative like this now, you can really be on the forefront of what will be hopefully considered to be standard research practice going forward. So if you're interested in writing a lab handbook, how can we help you develop your own? So how can you go about writing a lab handbook? Well, there's no prescriptive formula, but there's a few things that we can suggest, which will hopefully help you be able to put your one together. The first is to use some resources that myself and other members of our department have developed in order to build the foundation of your lab handbook. And the second is to work with your group to write your handbook where possible to do so. So what resources have we established to help you get started? The first is a lab handbook template, which has been established by myself and other members of our department. This template consists of a series of questions, and by answering these questions, you can help form the skeleton of your lab handbook. The second is a lab handbook which has been written by the WIN Physics group, which can give you a bit of a sense of what a document like this can look like, and hopefully help generate ideas for what could be included in your handbook. And finally, we recently published a article motivating the use of lab handbooks. This article effectively recapitulates a lot of what I'm describing here in this presentation, and this can be a really useful way to communicate the idea of lab handbooks with other lab members, in addition to having access to these resources as well. So how could you use these resources? Well, the first way is that you may, for example, read our lab handbook and find that a lot of the content in it resonates really well with your research group. You can then take this and edit it to fit your research group, and then you would have your handbook. The second would be to use our lab handbook and our resources for ideas, and then write the lab handbook with your group from scratch. Or finally, really whatever works best for your group. It could be a hybrid option between the two described above, or perhaps something different, which is more suitable for how your group operates. And finally, I just want to finish by motivating why I believe that it's really important to write the lab handbook with your group, as opposed to being written by an individual or a small group of individuals. Firstly, it shares the burden of writing. We are all extremely busy people, and we know that when tasks like this are left to an individual or just a few individuals, it can really stretch out the timelines for writing, or perhaps mean that the lab handbook will never be written. In addition, by writing the lab handbook with your group, it really provides a foundation to hopefully improve what is currently considered best practice of the lab. What I mean by this is that by having a conversation about how the lab currently operates, you can hopefully identify areas where improvements could be made, or address ambiguities in terms of understanding of individual group members. In addition to this, by writing a lab handbook with your group, it will mean that members can really commit to the values that your lab handbook contains. It's much easier to get people to commit to a set of values that they've been part of forming, as opposed to telling people how the group should operate. In addition, some topics are really only identified with a breadth of input. Now, it's our experience in terms of writing the lab handbook that individuals have got their own set of priorities and things that they consider to be important. And if a lab handbook is written by just a few individuals or a single individual, some topics which can be considered very important to others may not be included. And by including a group and getting that breadth of input, you can really cover a wide range of topics, which will be really important to individual members. And finally, we believe that the exercise of writing the lab handbook itself can really help bring members together. It was our experience that having the opportunity to speak as a group about how the lab operates was something which we really valued, and it really became a team building exercise in itself. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. If you scan this QR code, you should hopefully get a direct link to the lab handbook paper, which has been published. Or alternatively, you can just search lab handbook eLife online, which will hopefully provide you with that link to the article, in addition to the resources within. And with that, I thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was a very interesting and different presentation, so I appreciate. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So the first question, love this. How can you make sure people follow the guidelines of the handbook?
So I think one of the best things in terms of the lab handbook is it provides us with a document of accountability. Now, it's challenging to make people follow a set of rules, but it's much easier to know if you do have a set of rules, if people aren't following them. And so if you find that you have a list of things which are expected of individual group members written in a handbook, and somebody isn't abiding by those principles, it is much easier to raise a conversation with them, or perhaps if necessary, another member of the lab, in order to make an intervention to prevent that from going further. So hopefully by communicating specifically what the principles are that you should be following, this makes it much easier to ensure that people are following those principles.
Good. And I guess this sort of goes also into the second question that we have. So how dynamic is the content of the handbook? Do you often have to revise it?
So the way which we think about the lab handbook is as an evolving document. And so what we mean by this is that you write the handbook and then you have what you consider to be the best common practice in your lab. But those things can change. And as time goes on, you might find that there are perhaps different approaches which are better, or perhaps there are things which are written down which aren't clear. So what we advise in terms of the lab handbook is to revisit it periodically. Our suggestion is perhaps every year, where you can go through the document, discuss it as a group, and identify if there are places where improvements or changes can be made.
Okay, that makes sense. So, and a question that I had, so when a person joins a group, do you usually give out, for example, the handbook? So what if that person doesn't agree with something? So how do you deal with that?
Well, so that situation itself hasn't come up for us. But what I would hope is that were that situation to come up, there's really two things. The first is to engage in what would hopefully be a constructive conversation as to why we believe that this principle is important and how it benefits individual group members. Alternatively, if there's something which somebody raises which they don't agree with, it provides us with the opportunity to discuss that topic as a group and to see perhaps if the person who's joining, does raise a point and if there are changes that should be made. A lot of this, I think our experience for this and some of the motivation for any lab handbook is one of the big challenges is in terms of ambiguity. And oftentimes in lab settings, when we communicate ideas, are we actually communicating effectively what we mean versus what other people interpret? And so I would hope that that would be the best ways to address that.